Hi, this is Weihao at Direct Impact Solutions.
This video is going to be talking about the scope of variables. We will explain the difference between the three variable scopes and then introduce some common use cases for them. Also, did you know FileMaker secretly introduced a fourth scope type with the introduction of the while function? Stick around until the end of the video to learn more about this. Once upon a time when things were simpler, we were told three variable scopes: global, local, and function. It might be easier to show the relationship between different variable scopes using this image. At the highest level, we have global variables. Global variables operate at the file level. They're identified by the double dollar sign in front of the variable name. And once the global variable is created anywhere in the file, uh, they will live until the file is closed or if they're manually cleared out. It can be read and written in any scripts and calculations that reside in the same file while the variable is alive. So because global variables can be accessed across the whole file, they're commonly used to store system-level metadata, such as application version, user account name. If you look at this demo file that we copy and pasted from the previous video we made, it has a on first window open script trigger, and we set a global variable here that will be used to display the subject of the demo file right here. So because this is a global variable accessible throughout the whole file, when we want to create a new demo file like we're doing right now, all I need to do is just change this global variable to a new value. So in this case, we're talking about variable scope. So let me change that to that. Run the file, run the script again. And you can see that the subject on the top left corner of the layout have been updated. And if I have multiple layouts in this file, all of them will be updated all at once without the need to manually change the subject on the layout for every one of them. And starting with FileMaker 16, you can even use global variables to specify external data sources, something like this. Notice that we use a global variable named data source to specify an external data source for our solution so that if we want to point the solution to different data sources, we can dynamically make that change. If you're interested in this subject, check out the link in the description below to learn more about this feature. Global variables seem to be very convenient because you can define it once and use it everywhere. But due to this characteristic, global variables also require a lot of maintenance. Suppose you are using global variables in one part of your solution, it's very common to get an unexpected result because you forgot that the same variable can be set in a different part of your solution. Personally, I would suggest using global variables to store values that don't change much during the user session. If you need to use globals to store values that frequently change, it's a good practice to clear your globals after being done with them. Because of the amount of maintenance required, one thing I don't recommend doing with global variables is to use them to pass data between scripts. Now that we have script parameters and JSON functions, it's better to use them to pass data. So sitting one level below the global variables, we have local variables. Local variables are identified by a single dollar sign in front of their variable names. Local variables operate at the script level. So once a local variable is created in a script, it will live on until the script ends or manually cleared out. A local variable can be read and written in any script steps or calculations in the same script while it's alive. Although that last sentence I just said is not a precise description of the local variable scope, but we will get on that in a second. Compared to the global variables, local variables get automatically cleared out when the script ends, so it requires much less maintenance to use. The most common usage for local variables is to use them as temporary storage space within a script. However, it can actually do way more than that. For example, you can access local variables outside of your script from your layout or even from the security setting. We won't have enough time to explore all of them in this video. I will create a FileMaker cool tricks video in the future to introduce some of these smart but lesser known techniques for local variables. One thing to know is that local variables defined in one script are not accessible from its subscripts. Each script has its own scope. So a more accurate representation of local variable scope is more like this. As mentioned earlier, if you do want to pass values between scripts, use the script parameter feature. As for function variables, they have no prefix, although personally I add an underscore in front of function variables to differentiate them from actual function names. One quick example to show here is actually something we created from the last video. As you can see, for the function variables in this while function, I put a underscore in front of all the function variables that I'm working with. The scope of function variables is a little bit complicated because their scopes can be nested. So before FileMaker 18, the only native FileMaker function that allows you to set variables is the let function. If you nest multiple let functions together, the outer ones are considered to have a higher scope than the inner ones. So for example, here we have two let functions nested together. In this case, the outer one, this one, is the higher scope one, and the one inside is the lower scope one. And function variables that are defined in higher scope ones can be read from lower scopes. Notice that this is slightly different from the global or local variables. For those two, they can be both read and written within local scopes, within lower scopes, but function variables can only be read but not written within lower scopes. This means if you name a variable in the lower scope function the same as a variable named in a higher scope function, they are independent. So check out this particular example. In the higher scope let function, we have 4 variables, variable 1, 2, 3, 4. And then in the lower scope function, we defined another variable 3 in here and use that as the output of the let function. So if we look at this, examine this particular expression, variable 3 is equal to variable 3 plus 1. This variable 3 is the declaration of a variable within the second let function. And this variable 3 is actually referring to the variable 3 that was defined in the higher scope let function. So since we assign the value 3 to the first let function's variable 3, this evaluates to be 4, because this is 3 coming from here, and since we passed that out as the return of the let function, the value of it is given to variable 4. That's why the entire output of it is the value of variable 4 is 4. But if you think about variable 3, if assuming the lower function can both read and write to a higher function's variable, then when we do this, it would have already adding 1 to variable 3. So if we output the value of variable 3, it should output 4 instead of 3. But in reality, it stayed as 3 because from the higher scope, this variable 3 is independent from this variable 3 within the lower scope. And it has no visibility over what is happening inside this lower scope function. So at the end of the first let function, its value remains a 3, regardless of what happened inside here. Now, fast forward to now. With the while function introduced in FileMaker 18, FileMaker introduced a fourth hidden scope. It doesn't have a name, but I call it the loop scope. If you're not familiar with the while function, check out the video we published last week. A link will be provided in the description below. We know that a while function has 4 parameters. Let's try adding one here. We have the initial variable, the condition, the logic, and the result. If you compare a while function to a let function, you'll realize they're actually very similar. So in certain situations, a while function can actually collapse into a let function. Here is an example. Here I have a while function together with a let function. If you set the condition to 0 and empty out the scope, the logic parameter, these two functions will perform exactly the same. Because essentially what we're saying here is we're going to let you declare a bunch of variables at the beginning of the function, and we're going to run through no loops at all. We're not going to do anything about those variables you declared in the first parameter, and in the result, we're going to reference them to calculate whatever result that you want to output. This is exactly how let function behaves. And similar to nested let functions, if you put another let function or a while function inside the first or the last parameter, the scope behavior is the same as nested let function, meaning that as a lower scope function, it has read-only access to the higher scope function variables, but it doesn't have a write access to it. So far, so good. So what's new in the while function is that it introduced another parameter that allows you to set variables, which is in the third parameter, the logic parameter. So let's look at the example that we used in the previous video. In this while function, in the third parameter, we are setting variables. We're setting 4 of them, actually. In these places, you only see me setting function variables in here, but in reality, you can set globals and local variables in here if you want to. So if you do set a global and local variable in here, they behave as expected, meaning that if you set their values, the changes are visible within their corresponding scope. So if you update a global here, that change can be seen in the whole file. For example, if I remember we had that header variable that we used to display the subject, I can actually update the header in here. Let's just say it's going to be a new header. And, oh, missing something. And if I run this, I'm going to use a data viewer here to see it. Right now, the header shows variable scope. I'm going to run this script and becomes new header. The reason this is not updating here is simply because it requires a refresh window for that to refresh the display. But as you can see, the change I made within that while function for the global variable is visible for the whole file. And similarly for local variable as well. So if you are in the middle of a script and you use a let function to change a local variable, that change is visible throughout the rest of the script. But what if you set a function variable in the logic parameter, which is exactly what we were doing in this formula. So let me get rid of this one. We're setting 4 function variables. 3 of them are declared. Actually, 2 of them are declared in the first parameter. The abbreviation was declared to be initialized to be empty, and the word counter is initialized and declared to be 1. But for word to process as well as first letter, both of them are not declared in the first parameter. So what's going to happen is that if a function variable is only declared in the third parameter of the while function, after each loop, their values will be cleared out. So they will only live a single loop. We have spent a lot of time talking about variable scopes. One important thing that we use to define the scope of a variable is the variable's lifespan. Global variables live and die with the file. So when the file is closed, the globals get cleared. Local variables live and die with a script. So when the script ends, they get cleared out. By that logic, function variables should live and die with a function. But clearly, with the while function, some variables get cleared sooner and more frequently than other variables. This tells us that there is actually a hidden 4th scope within the while function's logic parameter. Variables declared in this scope live and die with a loop. And when the loop ends, they get cleared out. So by the same naming logic, we should call this the loop scope. And at this moment, the loop scope only exists within a while function and behaves like a lower level scope to the while function that contains it. Within the loop, we have both read and write access to variables declared in its parent while function, and read-only access to variables declared in even higher level scopes. So if we take while function into consideration, a more up-to-date representation of different scopes should be like this. You might be wondering, why do I care about function variables when I already have global and local variables to work with? Well, the calculation engine is a powerful tool that FileMaker offers to handle business logic. Being able to work with let and while function will unlock the full potential of the calculation engine. And in order to work with the let and while function, we need to know how to work with function variables. And that is why we spend a lot of time in this video talking about the scope of function variables. So thanks for watching this video. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment down below and tell us what else are you interested in learning. I'll see you next time.